Coming up on today's episode.
We're getting increasingly complex issues manifesting in student populations. I get incredibly frustrated just in any media discourse looking at young people who to just brush them off as kind of frivolous, radically left-wing people who are going to moan about the state of the world no matter what we're doing, and they're just given the worst brushstrokes in so much discourse, and that's incredibly frustrating. Everyone that I know that goes to work in the charity sector comes in being hugely value-driven, strong sense of social justice, really passionate about making impact and positive change, does great work, but we always see all the other things we need to be working on rather than things we're making positive changes.
Welcome to The Changemakers, a new podcast shining a light on the people who dedicate their careers to changing the lives of others. I'm Lydia Parkin.
And I'm Claire Edwards.
We're both former journalists who now work in the third sector.
In this podcast, we will talk to society's fixers, menders, mopper-uppers and fighters about why they do their job, what they see in their work and why it matters. This is a commentary on our world and the lives of the often unsung heroes within it, who can only do their work because members of the public choose to support them through donations or fundraising activity.
To them, their job may just be that, their job. But to us, it's remarkable what they do and achieve every day. Their stories deserve to be heard.
Dom Smithies is the Influencing and Advocacy Lead at Student Minds, the UK's student mental health charity, working to transform the state of student mental health for the better. He oversees their policy, insight and engagement functions, which involves listening to students, understanding the issues affecting them and trying to influence positive change.
2 points of note before we begin. We recorded this podcast at the end of 2022, so the political landscape has changed a little since our last conversation. And also a word of warning, we do mention the topic of suicide, so please do take care while listening. Without further ado, welcome to the Changemakers podcast, Dom. Welcome to the podcast, Dom. Thank you so much for coming on. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
We'd like to take you back to the beginning. So what led you to this role, to apply for this role? Was there something in particular which made this something that was quite close to your heart?
My journey into Student Minds to cast myself back probably was from when I was a student myself at university many years ago, studying philosophy at York back in 2013 through to 2016. It was around the time when I think talking about mental health was very different to where we are a decade on now. It still wasn't spoken about very openly. I still think there was a lot of stigma attached to conversations about mental health. My time at university, I got very involved in a lot of the student politics, student activism. I was very involved in my liberation group and my students' union, so part of the LGBTQ network, did lots of campaigning through them, very engaged in the student union, very engaged in my college, where I got elected to quite a few welfare roles, which back then by welfare, I think what we meant was doing a lot of community events. Like I remember in my first year, the stuff we were doing were planning like the non-alcoholic Christmas party in December and doing an Easter egg hunt for everyone and all the fun community stuff. But then there was a real shift in my second year when, unfortunately, there was a cluster of suicides in my second year, and you could feel the mood shift on campus just in terms of how mental health was spoken about. Lots of people suddenly becoming very aware, if they weren't already, of mental health as an issue and how it's affecting the student population. Lots of people obviously really struggling with it. University got national press coverage. University was massively under fire for, I suppose, being perceived to be handling student mental health badly. But I think they responded very proactively and positively to it, to not trying to bury their head in the sand or go on the defensive, but actually opening up the conversation with students, of trying to understand what the issue is with student mental health, what's going on for students.
Were you affected by that? Were the people that you knew? How did that impact on you personally?
I think there were 5 back in my second year, although I didn't know any of them personally at that point, although a number of them were in my college when I was in a role that was responsible for welfare. So my peers were close to people that had died. So kind of knew of people that knew of them, so distantly impacted. I suppose it just meant the focus of what my role was when I was in a position to be doing lots of stuff within my community and supporting my peers to know what services exist and be signposting to support. Like all of a sudden the need for my role became more apparent. So the shift for me was we're spending all of our time focused on doing the fun stuff, to then actually having to take it more, I don't want to say more seriously, as if doing the fun community stuff isn't important, but there was a paradigm shift in, I suppose, what we had to deliver all of a sudden. It wasn't until my 4th year that we did have another suicide of someone that I did actually know, was a little bit closer to, someone who actually ran to be a sabbatical officer at the same time as me, which was a lot more impactful because that obviously hit a little bit closer to home. Knew a lot more people even closely who are affected by that, and emotionally I saw the impact of that much more significantly. But I think at that point I was already somewhat set on the mission, but it's, I suppose, all of those instances that just remind you and reiterate the importance of the work you're doing and keep you on that path. So thankfully haven't been too close to too many deaths, but have known some, but obviously you don't want there to be any, really. There doesn't need to be. So, and I saw the sabbatical officers in the student union at the time taking really inspiring leadership in grappling with student mental health as an issue, trying to understand what the issues are, what the solutions could be, which kind of led me to stay on my journey of being involved in the liberation groups, being very active within my college, and then going on to be a sabbatical officer in the student union myself. So I went straight into Student Minds from my time in my student union. My first role was, it was a research position, actually, kind of student engagement research position, specifically focused on LGBTQ student mental health, but broadly looking to improve the organisation's understanding of health inequalities and I suppose intersectional student engagement. But it did feel somewhat serendipitous that job existed right as I was looking for one, because I remember having a conversation with my supervisor in my final year and talking about careers and what we wanted to do. And I was just like, wow, I love the idea of charity sector, would love to work in like LGBT rights, lots of activism there. I was thinking about Stonewall at the time, but then I was also getting massively swayed to think about mental health. And I was like also in love with higher education, just the communities that exist on campuses with universities and student unions. I was like, some kind of intersection of higher education, mental health, equality and diversity, like something that does all of that would be great. And he was just like, all of those things individually sound great, but good luck finding something that ticks all of those boxes. And then, well, right place, right time with Student Minds, I found something
meant
that
to be.
Yeah, and they've just not managed to get rid of me yet, I guess. And here I am, still 5 years on.
It sounds like sort of the campaigning life was a little bit in your blood if you started from first year, kind of getting involved in all those societies and everything that you did from the beginning. Does that go further back from you? Is that something that stems from being younger, that kind of wanting to campaign and fight for the rights of people?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's just reflecting on my upbringing. I think it's really core and key to my values of social justice that I was brought up with from my parents, both very strong in recognizing the importance of being active within your community, recognizing, I suppose, the injustices across the world. My mum was very engaged, very active in her church. Back when I was a lot younger, I was too, got involved in lots of the campaigning they did around international aid. And I think even though the focus of what issues within social justice I've taken on and have become important to me as I've navigated, I suppose, my own life and journey, the values of being active in a community and seeking to serve and do work that creates positive change in the world, I suppose, has remained. So, which I think is exactly what they'd want. They wouldn't want to dictate what causes I work on. They just want to see me being active in causes that are important and relevant to me.
There can sometimes be a perception of university that, you know, incredible experiences, so much fun, but is that the reality?
And it is an interesting picture. I think it's nuanced and complex, and there's a mixed bag to it for sure. With I think we're often talking about a lot of the negative, and I think it is important to recognise students are a unique population that come with unique challenges, and that's why it's important to consider them separately to the general population in terms of there are challenges with going to university. It is a challenging transition. You're mostly often moving away from home, becoming financially independent all of a sudden, especially now at a time when there's so much financial insecurity that's causing huge amounts of stress and strain on students who aren't necessarily always the best equipped to be handling that independence. On top of the academic pressures to perform, to get a graduate job that is of such an esteem that it justifies the cost that is going to higher education. The kind of you've seen over the years with the change in fees how the focus is on the pressures shifted because you're not going for the love of the subject and the love of learning as much anymore. I'm sure that obviously does exist, but there's so much new and additional pressure I've noticed just over the last decade on employment and finances and what you're going to go on and do after you finish. And it's changed for sure. But there is, I don't just want to paint the negative picture, because there is actually something that is protective about university communities. And we do see, when comparing student populations to youth populations that don't go to university, because it's about a 50-50 split, just over half of young people do go to university now, but it's fairly close. There is something protective and good about university culture in terms of talking about mental health. So obviously something is being done right, whether that's the community feel people get, whether that's just the type of people that universities attract. They're on, I suppose, certain paths, career paths and progression that they feel a little bit more stable, or whether it's just that potentially people going to university are from more privileged backgrounds, have more security. Don't know, lots of speculation. So it's a mixed picture. There's good and bad with the student population.
How are students when they arrive at university? Is this a fallout from school, from life beforehand? Are they already arriving with poor mental health or vulnerability with their mental health? And is university contributing to that? Or do you think there's something about the shift to university that is amplifying it, i.e. if they didn't come to university, may things have gone differently? Do you have any sense of that?
I mean, it's hard to say objectively, because obviously you can't compare that difference, but we do see that there is a little bit of a hot potato around whose responsibility it is to be. I think not so much the struggling with mental health, because that varies massively, but how equipped students and young people feel to manage their own mental health and reach out for support when they need it. And obviously, separate conversation, the support actually being available to them and accessible to them at the point they need it. We do see that difference with universities and people in the higher education sector, many of them calling for much more to be done at that school level, that young level, in terms of developing a knowledge and understanding of emotional well-being, mental health, giving them the space to explore that, potentially in a classroom when you've got those more intimate settings, because university communities are very different. It's so much focus on independent learning that you can have a huge range. You can have some students who are going on to courses with 4 contact hours a week, and some that are in classrooms for 40 hours. So and you do see that difference as well between the humanities students and the sciences when they've got different contact hours. So you definitely see people coming into university. We know there's been emerging trends over the years with disclosure rates coming into university, that we're getting increasingly complex issues being manifesting in student populations. And we've seen, obviously, student population also grow quite a lot in the last decade. We've got about 2.5 million students, young people going to university now, which is a huge shift from where it was about a decade ago. So increasing numbers with increasing complexity is being found. But the question I do always have, and it's yet another debate that's kind of had in the sector, of using disclosures as a measure of changing trends isn't necessarily always the most helpful or accurate, because there's obviously also something really good in the fact disclosure rates are going up in terms of people are feeling more confident and comfortable in sharing that information with people, more confident and comfortable in seeking help and talking about their mental health openly. And there's lots of good in rising disclosure rates, which sounds really contradictory, but it's a hard one to just look at that and be like, oh, that means everything's getting bad because it's going up. But there is obviously something good and valuable in that. But obviously the question then goes to, well, knowing the increasing population size and complexity of issues that they're coming into university with, do we have all the support available to them? Are we equipped and ready to support them with the varying complex needs that they're bringing into university? And that's the challenge I think the sector's now at the point of navigating.
And there's lots to talk about in terms of tackling and solutions. And what do you think is the most effective part of the work you're doing at Student Minds?
One of the main things for us, reflecting on over the last 5 years, how we've had to focus our efforts, is recognizing, I suppose, how we can build power to create change, and in doing so, understanding actually what can we do to be equipping the sector to make the change. Because what we recognized very quickly is there was the desire and the want to do good, but I think what was missing a lot across the sector was actually the understanding of how to do it. There wasn't a lot of literature, there wasn't a lot of research that was concrete and solid, there wasn't best practice. We're at the stage where everyone was just having to try things and see how they go. And I think it's a challenge because it's a sector that's incredibly competitive, it's marketized, so that's the nature of it. So institutions being willing to share that learning, to share the failings most of all, which is usually the best learning that you can ask for. It's not the best practice, it's what did you try that failed completely. Getting people to share that is a big push. One of our big flagship pieces of work was our work around the University Mental Health Charter, which started with a huge round of listening. We went on tour at Student Minds, doing a bit of a road trip around the UK to talk to students, to talk to staff across the country. We did surveys as well, which was our most comprehensive piece of research, where we were trying to understand student mental health in its broadest sense. We were trying to move away from looking at mental health just being a student support services issue, just oh, you've got a mental health problem, there's counselling, how do we make counselling as great as it can be, when actually taking a strategic approach, a holistic approach to understanding what a whole university approach to student mental health looks like. You know, how can we make sure the welcomes are done properly so students transition in seamlessly? How can we make sure academic tutors are linked up to services so that they can share information? How can we make sure the student union is building a community in an effective way? You know, what's the role that absolutely everyone in the university community has to play, including students, to ensure that everyone's having the best experience possible? And I think within that, we also somewhat expanded our scope as an organization, because student mental health, as we've discovered through the research, is so intrinsically linked to staff mental health as well. It's an incredibly stressful environment to work in. Academics are under huge amounts of pressure often, and that we see that impact. So it's moving to a community focus, and then what that comes back to us at is, well, what we're trying to achieve. And instead of being very clear, easy wins of more funding for a service or improving accessibility, we're going back to that question of how do you achieve culture change across quite large communities effectively? And that's hard to do effectively, but I think through the charter program, we're trying to get institutions to reflect on that, look at the good practice that exists, and engage in that process of being very transparent with what they're trying, being open to failing, and being open to sharing their learning with others, so collectively the sector betters itself. So I think the flagship thing we do really is just facilitate that learning.
And the mental health charter that you mentioned there, so 58 universities have signed up. Were you pleased with how many have signed up? And why do you think some haven't kind of got on board?
Because there are some notable names missing.
Yes, there always will be.
Looking at the list, there are some of the top, Oxbridge isn't on there. What about those that are missing?
Yeah, we are. I mean, pragmatically, in terms of scaling this work, probably somewhat relieved that we didn't have everyone all at once, because that would have front-loaded the work quite considerably and not given us the time to really learn how to deliver this program in a sustainable, helpful way for the sector. So I think our ambition was by 2030, or by within 10 years, to have had every single university go through, obviously sign up to the charter and go through the award process at least once over 10 years. That felt scalable and achievable and doable. And we obviously had massive interest from the sector, lots of institutions really keen to develop their practice, register with us, not necessarily meaning they'll go through the award straight away, but meaning they're wanting to be part of that network of sharing learning, sharing practice, pulling on us for our expertise. And that's been great to see such interest early on. I think there are advantages to the fact that it is a competitive market, and that once you see how many universities are engaging in schemes like this, you can then see the ones that aren't, and they're competitive. If 90% of the university sector is doing something, the other 10% are like, oh, should we be doing that as well? So people will come along if the work is impactful. If we're doing good for the universities that are engaging in the program, they're like improving their policies, their practices, students are happy and having better experiences, others will follow along. So would much rather work with a smaller batch and get it right, and then have others come along, than to be overwhelmed with interest too early on before we're equipped to deal with them.
Looking at the whole competition side of it, as you were saying, you've got the Times who publish their top universities list every year, and they've recently named University of Bath the top university this year. And looking at how they came to that conclusion, it was facilities, it's academic strengths, it's graduate prospects, it's student satisfaction. Same for when they rank universities in their own league, it seems to be more about graduate schools and research quality and teaching quality. I couldn't see any real mention of student wellbeing. Should that be something that universities are being scored for?
Obviously, what we want to do is be supporting every institution to be a better version of themselves, and in going through that award process, getting feedback from us, being assessed. We're inviting them to be very transparent, to develop their policies, their practices, and then come back 3-5 years later and be like, we've changed all this stuff, and us to go, you're improving, and that's good. And I think there's something about the competitive process which would inadvertently create barriers for those that are potentially perceived to be behind. And it would mean that universities aren't signing up to the charter, aren't engaging to it until they were confident that they were going to get a gold star or whatever the award is, which just doesn't feel like the right avenue and way of achieving change and actually helping people to do better. We have seen some league tables attempt to use wellbeing, mental health measures as a way to additionally score. And in principle, I think it's great for students to be able to see, how much university is working on supporting students. And I think that's a really important thing students should be able to know in making those choices. My skepticism is I don't know how on earth you'd be able to measure that in a way which was fair, accurate, and not completely reductive, because universities are not homogenous. They're incredibly diverse. They're supporting different communities. You've got Russell Group universities that are serving completely different populations to other universities. You've got rural versus city based in terms of what what care might be available and accessible through NHS. There's lots that's different, which almost makes it seem unfair to compare them just against each other as if there's no other factors relating to how students get supported. That, while in principle it would be great, I have no idea how on earth anyone would be able to do it fairly. And then my worry would be that we'd inadvertently misinform students, give them the wrong information, and then we'd be negatively impacting student choice. So I have seen some attempts made to do it. I've seen some people use measures like how much funding university puts in, like per head, and how many staff are in a counselling service per head or whatever. But that, in that funding, do you include 10% of an academic's time is going to be as a pastoral tutor? Do you factor that in? Do you not? Like, how much is embedded across the university that wouldn't be designated within the mental health budget, but everyone's been trained in mental health first aid or whatever? I think it's too complex an issue to be reductive with one measure, so I'd be cautious, I suppose, is my answer.
I wanted to ask you about your role and how you feel it's contributing to the change that you'd like to see within student mental health.
Yeah, good question. I think obviously in my role it's spread across quite a number of remits, so probably we'll touch upon all of them, I suppose, why they're important and how they fit together on the journey. With starting with insights, I suppose I should start by saying that officially and formally, kind of our listening function and our insights function really only formally developed and then rapidly grew out of the pandemic, as just a lot of activity, student-led activity, was having to shift because of the nature of the pandemic. Just so much was happening at such speed at and even a national level, a sector level, policy-wise, it was just intense at that time in the charity sector to be keeping on top of everything that was going on. That we kind of recognise how important it is just to have capacity dedicated within a team to just listening and understanding and keeping tabs on everything that's going on. And we've wondered, we're like, oh, is that just a pandemic thing? But even just looking to the start of this academic year, the speed at which government changes happen, just everything going on nationally, it's just like every time there's one issue ends, another one seems to crop up. So it's so crucial that we understand what's going on, otherwise we kind of can lose touch. It keeps us open to, while we do have that strategic vision for understanding what we want to do proactively, we obviously can't lose sight of everything that's happening on the ground that we need to be reacting to. So there's the fun dynamic, I suppose, I play in my team, in the organisation, that me and my team are kind of on, mostly on the side of doing a lot of the work that's reactive and responsive, usually trying to work out what are the things that are distractions and what are the things that are opportunities that actually we need to be engaging in. And then there's all that policy work that we do, which engaging in all of the stuff with public affairs, in terms of, I don't think a week has gone by in the last few months that we haven't had one consultation that we're trying to respond to. Currently doing one for the Welsh Government on their approach to student support packages. There's so many opportunities at the moment, because it is a hot topic issue to be looking at student mental health, that there's lots of opportunities to be engaging government and national bodies on the policy work that needs to happen. But then on the campaigning side, that is trying to recognise the issues that aren't being picked up in consultations, where opportunities aren't being afforded to us to speak about the things that actually we think matters. And there's lots of things that the sector, that government issues, they might want to brush under the carpet or not give attention to, usually because the solutions to them are costly or time consuming or complex, or would have to come with some kind of apology or acknowledgement of failure. So there's lots of issues that don't get the attention, and it's that work which I think is really important, but also probably the most challenging. I think cost of living probably is one that's just dominating the agenda for us at the moment. It's at the forefront of our minds. It's something we're hugely concerned about, but the rate at which the sector, at which government can be responsive to such a huge issue is not going to be on par with the rate at which the issue is affecting people, and that's a worry. The role we can play is the space we give to students to empower them to share their experiences, tell their stories, know that there's at least some people in the sector that are listening to them, are trying to do good and right by them, and trying to do justice to, I suppose, all the experiences that we're privileged enough to have shared with us. We try to publish as many reports as we can that share all the insights we're lucky enough to get, and hopefully those reports go a long way to creating some ripples of change across the sector, but can't always know.
Just hearing you talk about your work there, it's clear you're very, very passionate about it, and you and your colleagues are doing amazing and important work in the sector. How do you kind of reflect on that, on your own personal contribution? And do you ever sort of take a step back and be like, well, like I'm part of that, I'm part of that change?
Yeah, not as often as I think most of us in the charity sector probably should, because for every one issue you're working on and making a difference in, there's 10 things you don't have the capacity to deal with. And that's the thing where you fall into the emotional burnout trap of this job. Of everyone that I know that goes to work in the charity sector comes in being hugely value driven, strong sense of social justice, really passionate about making impact and positive change, does great work, but we always see all the other things we need to be working on rather than things we're making positive change in. So it's something we need to do more of, for sure. But I think something I personally struggle with is working at a national level. You're a little bit further removed, I suppose, from the people you're helping. And this is me, I suppose, comparing the juxtaposition of when I worked in the student union. When you're working locally, you can have one person come in, spend hours with them, deal with a case, and you can see the impact that makes on like that one individual's lives. Whereas working at a national level, you don't get that immediate feedback of the impact of your work. You kind of just have to hope that you're putting out reports, you're going to all these roundtables, working with government on consultations and trying to be as active as you can on social media. You have to hope that all of this is leading to positive change on the ground. And obviously the evidence and the insights and the impact data says that we're doing some good somewhere, but you don't get that immediate, oh, I helped that person. You don't see it. That's something I sometimes struggle with. Definitely did in my early days, but I think it's something you kind of just have to have faith that your work isn't for naught and that good is being done. But it's definitely a challenge. But you just power on doing what you can to help people, I guess.
That is so powerful though, that you are channeling the comments that you get from students on the ground, and that you're able to get that feedback. You can absorb it and you can be like, how can we have those quick wins as well as the long-term strategic change and that sort of thing, that actually you can respond to the here and now. Because yes, otherwise if they're just going to their own university that's not necessarily big enough to have that kind of higher voice that they can go to, then feed that across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And for a lot of students, I think it's, especially when students are feeling very isolated and not connected in their communities or struggling with something very difficult, it can be very hard to find others going through similar experiences when you're in a local community. But I suppose when you're reaching out and engaging with us at that national level, and we're seeing students say the same thing, I hope and I imagine that can be really validating for students to know there are others going through similar experiences. And it doesn't feel like it's most impactful all of the time, but sometimes you do just get reminded that for some students it's just really empowering and validating to be listened to and see that there are others with similar challenges and that they're not alone, even if we don't have the solutions all of the time.
We haven't talked about the government really, have we?
No.
What is the change that you'd like to see in government policy around student health?
Stability would be nice, just to have longer term engagement, it's, I think, something I know my colleagues across the charity sector really struggle with, is it's very hard to build relationships, make positive change, equip ministers with the information we think they need to be making really great national choices when they're being shuffled around so frequently. But for the ministers we have now coming in, hello, hi, welcome to your new posts. What I would like to see you focusing on, I think right now, the most urgent issue is the cost of living crisis. That is impacting students. It is a mental health issue. Financial difficulties, financial stresses, just absolutely massively impactful on individuals' well-being. So I do think there needs to be a really strong general governmental response to the cost of living crisis in the way it's affecting everyone. But I do also think there's lots of student-specific things that need to be done in the short term and the longer term, with the short term being focused around generally being inclusive in policy making of students as a population. So as an example, obviously one of the recent interventions was the council tax rebate as a nice way to help people struggling with their energy bills. But students are obviously exempt from council tax and were thus also exempt from the council tax rebate. Obviously, they're still being hit by surging energy bills, but then didn't get any money back. So it's just complete oversight of a population in terms of people that are struggling with the issue, but not actually getting the support. So stop doing that, please. In terms of the longer term, I think there's some strategic changes, which I don't know if they're the right solutions. I'm throwing them out as things for government people to analyse and consider, but loans haven't been increasing with inflation for better part of a decade. So there's been, I suppose, real term cuts in terms of money in pocket that students have been getting, all the while rent has been increasing. Obviously, inflation's been going up, food bills all the more expensive, or students are getting less and less money. So reviewing whether loans should be kept in line with inflation so that students aren't facing real term cuts year on year would be good. Whether we need to be intervening more in terms of rent caps, energy caps, what's afforded to students on campus that's affordable. Otherwise, we're just potentially reinstating those barriers that exist that go against everything we're trying to achieve with social mobility in terms of the volunteering opportunities afforded to students at university are then only going to be able to be taken up by people who are privileged enough to afford to volunteer their time, who aren't needing to spend all their time working part-time to be able to make ends meet. Maintenance grants coming back, that would be great, seeing lots of people calling for that. Obviously all of these things cost lots of money, and my suspicion is with the budget that was recently announced, spending lots of money doesn't seem to be aligned with what they want to do. So it feels like an unwinnable ask, but if you just listen to what's happening to people on the ground, I don't understand how you can't be making the serious strategic investments that I think are going to be really important. It seems right to invest in young people's futures. I don't see how that isn't a good use of money, but I'm not an economist, so.
The change that you want to see really is change at government level, is at universities level. You're trying to influence a lot of big bodies, slow moving bodies. Do you think you'll get the change you want to see at those levels?
I mean, government ebbs and flows with the tide, so that's harder to comment on. Universities as a sector, we have more influence over, I suppose. I just in the 10 years of my existence, from back to when I was a student almost 10 years ago to where I am now, I've already seen so much positive change in the sector, which does reassure me that we're on the right track and doing the right things. Obviously still a really long way to go, but I think we've got a sector that has recognised student mental health as an urgent policy issue, is putting time and energy into addressing it, is making the right steps, is charging head on into the complexity of the issue. And I think obviously with our support is hopefully going to do some good. So I'm optimistic at a sector level we can achieve some really great change, but obviously all of those things require continued investment of staff time, energy capacity. By and large, I think the sector is moving as quick as it can be in dealing with a complex issue that we don't have the answers for. It'd be a lot easier if we knew what all the best practice was everywhere, but a lot of innovation is required, so it's going to take some time, but we're going in the right direction. Not sure I could say the same thing for government, so I'll hold my tongue.
I think that's incredible, honestly. I think the change that you've witnessed since you've been doing your role is absolutely testament to the work you're doing.
Thank you.
And we really should take that as an achievement of you and the organisation. You are a charity, and a small charity. Does that come into your thinking? Does that influence you? Does that impact you at all, the fact that you are a charity fighting for this change? Is that good? Should it stay that way? Is it a shame that it takes a charity to fight for this change?
Yeah, my comments about the charity sector existing, because there are gaps, I think I'll stand by, even if it might get me in trouble. But I do think it's good. There's pros to it, because we're afforded a lot of freedom in terms of being afforded the privilege to do this research, to work with students, and I suppose to be independent enough to be influencing the change. You know, we're in a position where charities are seen and trusted to be credible, but also people understand they're going to be campaigning, they're going to be working for positive change in the sectors they work in. So there's something liberating around it, which is good, and there's credibility and trust. You know, if we were public sector body that was like under the government, we'd then be tied, so it'd be somewhat more concerning. But there obviously are constraints on what we can do as a charity, because of funding, because of charity laws, because of capacity. Yeah, there's restrictions, but we do what we can.
And for anyone who's listening to this and feeling inspired by your work, the work of Student Minds, and wanting to know how they can get involved and how they could be part of the change, like, is there a simple thing that they could do kind of here and now? What would you say to them?
I mean, are we talking general audience or students or staff? Although I'm not even sure I'd actually give different answers.
Anyone. How can listeners be part of the change? And that is anyone, I think.
Anyone. I mean, I think so. I think higher education and students particularly, there's still a stigma and a perception that I think we're having to challenge, which is students being seen to be an incredibly privileged population, and young people more broadly. I get incredibly frustrated just in any media discourse looking at young people to just brush them off as kind of frivolous, radically left-wing people who are going to moan about the state of the world no matter what we're doing, and they're just given the worst brushstrokes in so much discourse, and that's incredibly frustrating. So my main advice to non-young people would be just to really challenge, I suppose, the perceptions and the assumptions that are made about young people broadly, students specifically, to speak to young people and understand what's going on in their lives and the challenges they're facing, because all young people are going through incredibly challenging transitions, and this is I don't think factually inaccurate to say, but one of the most financially challenging times to be a young person. I know there's a report that came out 6 or 7 years ago, back when I was at university, that said it's the first time in like modern British history that young people were financially worse off than their parents. And the fact there has been that turn is just incredibly concerning, and is going to have long-term changes. But my positive advice and wisdom for everyone, for all audiences, I think in talking about mental health, is just finding time and space for joy, whatever that means. I try to avoid talking about self-care, because I feel like that can be very prescriptive and convoluted. Whereas for me, I think just there's so much going on in the world, which just, if you've got eyes and ears and any amount of empathy, you can burn yourself out very, very easily. That I think sometimes it is really important to just be focusing on the small communities, you know, your family, your friends, your peers, and just engaging with them and finding time and space for for joy and connection. I think ultimately, if we give the space to that everywhere, good will happen. So that would be my general wisdom.
Very good wisdom.
What is success for you, Dom?
For Student Minds or me?
Both.
Oh, success for me. That's too existential. Don't know what I'm doing with my life. So for me, I suppose what good looks like is being at a point where the sector is confident and equipped to navigate the challenge of student mental health. You know, there's all the resources, all the guidance out there that exists so that they can do student support well, that students are having really positive experiences, they're really integrated in the communities, they can access university care, but also local care, that the transition into, through and out of university is easy and seamless, and they're going on to brilliant careers to do great, wonderful things with their lives. And that we've given the sector everything they need to be able to do that without us needing to exist, really is success. Hopefully we won't need to be here forever. As ever, there's always new issues that emerge. There's always stuff we need to be responsive to. So whether we get to that point of not existing or not, I don't know. But yeah, success for me looks like the sector has all the tools to exist and do well without us.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and talking so comprehensively about the work you're doing.
Yeah, we've loved having you on. Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you. Really inspiring to hear your story and how you're making change at Student Minds.
Trying to have fun editing. I feel like I've given you plenty to re-listen to, so hopefully don't get too bored of the sound of my voice.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, no. Thank you both. Have a good evening.
Dom, I absolutely did not get bored of the sound of your voice editing you. And can I just add, he is as modest as he comes across. So thank you, Dom, for this conversation and for everything you are personally doing to improve the experience that students will be having now and in the future when it comes to their mental well-being. If you've enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review. This has been The Changemakers.